was found in deepest antiquity, somewhere in the Deccan on the banks of the Godavari River. This diamond, the largest in the world, found its way into the eye of an idol in the temples of the Kakatiya dynasty, and then was captured by the idol-destroying, wicked Khalji dynasty as they swept down from Central Asia. It passed from them into the equally bloody hands of the Tughlaqs, and then the Lodis, and then the Mughals. Babur seized it. It went from Mughal to Mughal until Muhammad Shah Rangila famously hid it in his turban during the invasion of Nadir Shah. Nadir Shah got everything else that the Mughals got, but he didn't get the Kohinoor because he'd hidden it in his turban. Unfortunately, both Nadir Shah and Muhammad Shah Rangila were sleeping with the same courtesan, Nurbai. And Nurbai hinted to Nadir Shah that a turban swap might be an advantageous asset. And so as they were parting, Nadir Shah embraced Muhammad Shah Rangila and said, "My brother, as a final gesture of friendship, let us swap turbans." And so it was that the Kohinoor went to Persia. Now, every single detail that I told you just now is, I'm not sure this is language one should use in the age society, but still, it's bullshit. There's not one iota of truth or fact, hard fact, in any of that story. And one of the pleasures of doing this book has been the sensation that you get very rarely as a historian. Here is something that is really famous. Everyone knows about the Kohinoor. On our way into Bombay yesterday, we passed at least 2 hotels called Kohinoor, and probably a restaurant or 2 as well. Everyone knows this. Every Indian feels it's theirs, as does, incidentally, every Iranian, every Afghan, every Pakistani, every Sikh, and every member of the Taliban. The Taliban formally have put down a claim for the diamond. Mother Omar was very keen on rocks, like Marilyn Monroe, and not much those two have in common, but they like diamonds. It's a diamond that everyone feels possessive of, that everyone thinks they know. And yet, when you begin examining this history, you realize that this hardest of substances has been, for centuries, caught up in a swirl of vapor, that there is a miasma of legend and mythology so thick around it that it's almost impossible to distinguish truth from fact in most accounts. In actual fact, there's not a single solid, unambiguous, 100% clear reference to this diamond before, in 1751, the Persian soldier turned historian called Muhammad Marvi, who was with Nadir Shah in Delhi and who returned with him to Central Asia, writes in his history of Muhammad Shah's reign that I saw the Kohinoor. It was attached to the head of the peacock at the top of the peacock throne. At that point, the peacock throne was in Herat. Now, from this, we can speculate that it was probably there when Shah Jahan built the peacock throne in 1638. It's very unlikely that people were fiddling with the peacock and adding extra diamonds here and there to it. It's also likely that it came from India, because until the discovery of the New World mines in the 1720s and 30s, all the world's diamonds, with the exception of a few black diamonds from the hills of Borneo, all the world's diamonds came from this country. They were not mined. You don't mine diamonds in India. You find them and sieve them in the alluvial beds of extinct rivers. Rivers that emerge from the right geological consistency. And in those rivers, particularly the ones around Guntur in Andhra Pradesh, inland from Machilipatnam, for millennia, people have been finding tiny octahedral fragments, which were recognized from deepest antiquity to be the hardest and most extraordinary substance in the world. Very occasionally, diamonds grew a little larger, and you find these diamonds being treasured, not just in India, but exported already by 3000 BC. They're being used to polish the stones of the pyramids. They're used in very early Chinese jewelry. They're used very extensively, amazingly, in the jewelry of Augustan Rome. Particularly popular in Hellenic Afghanistan, that extraordinary lost world of stadia and Roman baths and amazing Greek theatres that once covered Central Asia, that lost Gandharan golden age. Very, very popular. They used to build rings with dolphins to support the bezel, and in the bezel would be embedded not the kind of flashy, brilliant cut diamond that we're used to seeing in jewellery shops today, but these little natural crystals that were considered around the world to be incredibly important. So diamonds always incredibly important in this country, but we simply do not know at what point the Kohinoor was mined, which particular bed or set of beds it came from. It's a pretty good guess that it came from the Deccan, but there are also diamond deposits in Bihar and Madhya Pradesh, less worked in antiquity. So the Golconda, which is the general fate, doesn't mean the fortress of Golconda, it means the within the boundaries of the old kingdom of Golconda, is a pretty good guess, but we don't know. There's not a single thing we know about how it came into Mughal hands, where it came into Mughal hands, when it came into Mughal hands. All we know for sure is how it left. To start at the beginning, in this country, diamonds have always been considered to be more than merely beautiful. They are believed in the early Puranas to be fragments of the divine. And the different Puranas have different versions of this understanding. In the Garudi Purnima, 10th century, there's a fantastic passage about the creation of gems. The demon Bala, it is written, agreed to be sacrificed by the gods and yielded up his ghost for the good of the universe. And behold, the severed limbs of his sacrificed body were converted into the seeds of gems. Then the Yakshas and the Siddhas and the Nagas eagerly rushed to collect the seeds of these gems, and there were mighty flutterings of celestial pinions and rustlings of celestial garments in the heavens. The gods came riding in their aerial cars and carried away the seeds of gems for their own use, some of which dropped to earth through the violent concussions of the air. Wherever they dropped, whether in oceans or rivers or mountains or wildernesses, there originated mines of these gems through the celestial potency of these seeds. Diamonds, it goes on, are the most precious of gems. The learned hold that diamonds are the most effulgent of all precious stones. The least particle of the bone of the conqueror Indra, falling or dropping down from the sky, germinates diamond crystals of varied shapes. Gods are supposed to dwell in the particles of a diamond, wherever found, possessed of a clear light shade and the usual commendable features. These are the qualities that will come to those who possess diamonds: prosperity, long life, increase in wives and progeny and domestic animals. These are pre-feminist times when domestic animals and wives are grouped as a single entity. And the bringing home of a teeming harvest with attendant on the use of a diamond. Serpents, tigers, and thieves all fly from the presence of a person wearing such a diamond. Now this, of course, is not our general experience. Those of you who have diamonds, I'm sure many here, will not find that thieves tend to run away from them these days. They do tend to act, indeed, as the opposite effect. So you find, in the next century, in the Bhagavad Purana, you find mention of the Samantika gem. And the Samantika gem is a gem that came in centuries later to be considered to be the Kohinoor. Because just like the Cymantica gem seemed to attract violence and envy and greed wherever it went, and to create bloodshed, so, as we will hear, in spectacular fashion, did the Kohinoor. And in fact, this book reads it's got a sort of very restrained cover with that imperial crown on. But in fact, we could put some incredibly gory Games of Thrones style, sort of lurid Technicolor front cover on it, because the story reads like a kind of late night horror film. And Anitra and I would sort of ring each other up in the middle of the night. And I just found the most incredible story. She said, no, mine's more bloody and awful than your story. And we would. But it's probably not bedtime reading for those with delicate disposition or anyone given for nightmares. It's an extraordinary, exciting, and a rather amazing story. But the important point is that this idea that a gem could be cursed, this is an idea which, of course, entered Victorian literature with Moonstone and other novels, such as Disraeli's youthful novel L'Enfer, which also centres on a cursed Indian gem arriving in England. This idea that a cursed diamond could exist is an idea that goes back to the Cymantica gem in the Bhagavad Purana. And the story, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's the time of Krishna, it's Dwarka, and Surya, the sun god, comes down in answer to the prayers of one of his devotees, and he gives this gem, which produces his effulgence, to the king of Dwarka, who gives it to his brother. The brother goes off into the forest and is killed immediately by a lion. The lion is then killed by a bear. Krishna is accused of the murder and has to go and get the diamond back from the bear. He gives it to his father-in-law. His father-in-law is then killed. And Krishna has to go and spin his disc and kill the wicked folk who killed his father-in-law. And so it goes on. Wherever the Cymantica gem goes, it creates bloodshed. The Mughals, when they come to India, though, have a quite different tradition of gemology that comes from the Persian tradition. So, as so often in Indian history, you find two very different sets of ideas, one Sanskritic and indigenous and Indian, and the other Middle Eastern or Arabic, coming and meeting. And in the plains of Delhi and northern India, these two sets of ideas meet initially violently, but then they interweave. So for the Mughals, let's have the first slide, if we can. How do we turn the PowerPoint on? For the Mughals, who of course came from Central Asia, diamonds were not the most precious gem. For the Mughals, what was really mattered was the spinels of Badakhshan. Spinels that look to us, I mean, I can't tell the difference between a spinel and a ruby, maybe some of you can. But it's the same sort of class of gem. These are bright red stones of light. And in Persian literature, this is the Kohinoor as it is today. In Persian literature, these red stones of light are most valued. It's very clear, for example, in Abul Faisal, that the first tier of the Mughal treasury is given over to spinels and rubies, red stones. And diamonds are shoved into the second tier, along with pearls, emeralds, and sapphires. So they're second rank of stone. But the Mughals make a huge deal of their gems. They love their gems. And particularly Jahangir and Shah Jahan have an obsession with gems. So much so that if you read the diaries of Jahangir, the Jahangir Nama, you will find almost boring length in which he describes the gifts. And he institutes this thing whereby every Nowroz on the 20th of March, he's weighed against precious stones, but all the nobles have to give him gems. And in many cases, advancement in court depends on finding a really fancy gem to give the emperor. And he says very clearly, so-and-so gave me a magnificent opal from Bihar, and I increased his rank, his mansabdarship, from 10,000 horse to 20,000 horse. So it made it clear it was in everyone's interest to give really precious gems. This meant that gems from across South Asia got sucked into the Mughal orbit and ended up in the Mughal treasury. So much so that by the time Shah Jahan comes to power, the treasury is heaving with the greatest gems in the world. It is the greatest gem collection ever formed. And as we know, anyone who's ever seen Mughal-e-Azam knows how Shah Jahan and father and son, Jahangir and Shah Jahan, didn't always get on and fought incessantly. But the thing that Jahangir was most proud of in his son was his connoisseurship of gems. And there are many accounts of this, both from father and from other witnesses. For example, there's an account of one Nowroz when Jahangir has just been given a particularly fine pearl. The Shah Jahan gets up and says, I know exactly where the pair of that pearl is, and we should make it into an earring. And he tells the servants that in such and such a place in the palace there is an old turban ornament, that the pearl on that is exactly the same. And man goes off, gets the pearl, and he puts it together, and Jahangir is thrilled to see that it is like a twin, that one. And so Shah Jahan had that. And then there's another description by one of the Portuguese friars, who was in Fatehpur, not in Fatehpur Sikri, was in Agra. And he says that the most beautiful dancing girls in the world were brought in at the end of a dinner and began to dance in the most lascivious manner, says this old Catholic priest. But the emperor did not look up, because Itmad ad-Dawla had just given him a set of gems, and his eyes remained fixed on these gems, and he didn't give the girls even a passing glance. It's a very telling little anecdote. So anyway, eventually, Mughal Agra fills with these fabulous gems. And Shah Jahan realizes that he's got to do something with them. He can't just leave all this stuff in sort of groaning vaults in the Red Fort. So here's what happens, and this is the account of the Padshahnama. In 1628, he summoned the French jeweler, Augustin Hiriart. And it's very intriguing. There are only two things the Mughals looked up to the Europeans for. One was gunnery and artillery. The Europeans were fabulous at artillery in Mughal eyes. Otherwise, according to Akbar, they were an assembly of savages. But there's one other thing they were good at, and that was they were ahead of the Mughals on jewel cutting technology. Diamond cutting was probably invented in India, but by the 1630s, the Jewish diamond trading networks of Amsterdam had become more advanced than those in India. And there are frequent accounts of the Mughals sending their gems to Goa in the care of the Jesuits in order to get them cut. There were also other accounts of them being sent to the Frankish jewelry colonies in Aleppo, of the tragic city so much in the news of late. So the Mughals would send off these wagon loads of jewels to be cut. And in return, you find these European fortune-hunting jewelers like Tavernier later, in this case Hiriart, coming to Agra to make a living. But Hiriart gets drunk and goes off to Goa and disappears before he finishes the commission, which is to build an enormous throne. And so it's completed by a Persian jeweler called Saidi Gilani. And Said Gilani is primarily a poet. He was famous as a poet and a calligrapher. But by this stage, he's running the imperial jewel office. And Shah Jahan commissions from him in 1628 the most expensive piece of furniture ever made in the history of the world. And this, of course, is the peacock throne. And the peacock throne, here we have the emperor sitting on it, is not a throne in the Western sense. It is a musnad with a canopy. It's a baldachin, a kiosk, and in it goes all the best stones that the Mughals have. And it costs to build 4 times the cost of the Taj Mahal. Here's the account from Ahmed Shah Lahori in the Padshahnama. In the course of years, many valuable gems had ended up in the imperial jewel house, each one of which might have served as an eardrop for Venus, or would adorn the girdle of the sun. Upon the accession of the emperor, it occurred to his mind that, in opinion of far-seeing men, the acquisition of such rare jewels and the keeping of such wonderful brilliance can only render one service, that of adorning the throne of empire. They ought therefore to be put to such use, that beholders might share in and benefit from their splendour, and that majesty might shine with increasing brilliancy. So the emperor ordered that rubies, garnets, diamonds, rich pearls and emeralds to the value of 200 lakhs of rupees should be brought for the inspection of the emperor, and that they, with some exquisite jewels of great weight, exceeding 50,000 miskals, having been carefully selected, should be handed over to the superintendent of the goldsmiths department. The idea was which was the idea that animated so much of Mughal art, was that you would use art as imperial propaganda. That all these gorgeous miniatures that we admire today across the road in the museum and so on, had a purpose, which was to glorify the empire. And in that sense, there's a strong contrast with Rajput art, which is all about romance and about legend and about mythology. It's religious. But Mughal art is very logical. It's about history. It's about dynastic propaganda. It's about chronicling. It's about diary. And in the same way, this great jeweled object, the Peacock Throne, would be a piece of imperial propaganda. It would be used in order to make on earth a mirror of the Quranic throne of Solomon. And the throne of Solomon is described in great detail in the Quran. And so all the details of the Peacock Throne, including the peacocks themselves, are taken from the Quranic descriptions. Any good, literate Muslim would see in the Peacock Throne a model of the throne of Solomon. And the idea that this would make the Mughals legitimate rulers, the representatives of God on earth, the Solomon of the day. Now, we don't know what happened, what happened to the diamond, if it was added later or was part of the original scheme, but the probability is it must have been there at the beginning. And it's extremely unlikely that Aurangzeb or any of the later, lesser emperors would have added enormous great diamonds to the existing scheme. We know, in fact, the opposite, that during the reign of Bahadur Shah I, during Farrukh Sir's reign, the Syed brothers, who were the regents, actually removed some stones from the Peacock Throne. So the probability is that the peacock that attached to one of those two heads is the Kohinoor. Anyway, so it goes on until the reign of Muhammad Shah Rangila. And Muhammad Shah Rangila is a lot of fun. We like Muhammad Shah Rangila. Muhammad Shah Rangila is here everything that his great-grandfather Aurangzeb would have despised and hated. Here he is, dressed in women's clothing, celebrating a Hindu festival in the Red Fort and throwing coloured paint, holy paint, at courtesans. Every single detail of that would have made Aurangzeb spin in the grave. Muhammad Shah Rangila is a great patron of the arts. He brings the tabla and the sitar into the Mughal court. He gets up to all sorts of stuff by day and by night. This is possibly an attempt to defend him from the charge of impotence that he's depicted here, making love in a way that no other Mughal emperor ever has been. Anyway, he spent far too long listening to music and getting up to this sort of stuff when he shouldn't be looking after his army, because it was his bad luck that he was a direct contemporary of this figure, who's a lot less fun. This is Nadir Shah, who is a remarkable figure, but as you can see from his expression, not the kind of guy you necessarily want to have dinner with. Nadir Shah is the son of a shepherd. He's an Afshar Turkmen, in that borderland, from that borderland between Iran and Afghanistan today, around Meshed. And he rose through sheer military brilliance to, first of all, command the Safavid army and then overthrow the last Safavid and put himself as the emperor of Persia, as the Badshah, the Shah. He had no interest in the arts. He had no sense of humour. A poet turned up while he was besieging Kandahar and started reciting celebratory odes, and he had he hated the poem so much he had the poet sold into slavery, but there were no buyers. So they then got his donkey and sold that into slavery instead, and the poet had to walk home back to Kabul. So he's not much fun, Nadir Shah, but he's a brilliant military strategist. And he comes up with one of the great military, or brings into use one of the great military innovations of its day, the precursor of the tank, effectively. And this is the swivel gun. And he realizes that if you build a tripod and attach it to a horse's harness, you can support a very large gun on horseback. And the swivel gun is like a huge, heavy jezail that you couldn't really carry in your hand. But if you have the tripod, you can ride with it. But it's not very mobile. It is on horseback, but you can't sort of maneuver with it. So in order to use it against the Mughals, he has to lure the Mughals out of their encampment. And in 1739, when he invades India, the Mughals move out of Delhi. 3 Mughal armies come together. The Wazir of Oud, Sadat Khan, the Nizam of Hyderabad, the first Nizam, and Muhammad Shah Rangila and the Delhi army meet at Karnal. And there are 1 million men in the camp. It's one of the largest armies ever assembled on Indian soil, if not the largest. But within that 1 million men, there are hundreds of dancing girls and saises and jokers and buffoons and all the rest of it who've all come up to the light. And there are reports from the Dutch East India Company who are watching this with anxiety, saying that whether any of these men will be up to fighting remains to be seen, despite the fact there's an ocean of humanity heading up to Karnal. And this is exactly what happens. These are not crack fighting troops. They are old-fashioned, chivalrous Mughals who love swordplay, who are longing to have a sort of nice bit of sort of fencing practice with the Persians, but they don't get the chance. Because Nadir Shah attacks, then organizes a feint retreat, and the Mughals, heavy cavalry, realize it's their big moment, and they charge out of the encampment. And just as they're about to engage the Persian forces, the light Persian cavalry part to reveal the swivel guns waiting. And within 10 minutes, the entire flower of Mughal chivalry is dead on the ground in Karnal. Nadir Shah captures the person of Muhammad Shah Rangila by the simple rules of inviting him to dinner. And the silly fool goes over and then is not allowed to go home again. And the two march into Delhi together. There is the famous Delhi massacre. And 2 months later, Nadir Shah leaves Delhi with the largest pile of loot ever taken out of this country. Now, the British knew a thing or two about looting India, and indeed loot is one of the very first Hindi words to enter English. But we were pathetic amateurs compared to Nadir Shah. He left Delhi with 700 elephants, 4,000 camels, and 12,000 horses carrying wagons, all of them filled with jewels and gold. And they spend a month before they leave melting down all the gold and ornaments into portable objects in order that they could be carried home. So much does Nadir Shah have that almost as an afterthought, as they're passing Pindi, he sends off presents to the Tsar of Russia, who of course is one of the great enemies of the Persians at this period, and to the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. And today, the Ottoman collections in the Hermitage and in the Topkapi Palace are the 2 best surviving collections of Mughal jewelry in existence. There is nothing here, or indeed in England, to match the brilliance of those 2 collections. And anyone really wanting to study Mughal jewelry has to go to Istanbul and to St. Petersburg today to see that. But he gets home, and he is now the wealthiest ruler in the world. He carves out this incredible empire based between Persia and Afghanistan. But like all tyrants, he begins to go a bit crazy. He's convinced that a failed assassination attempt has been masterminded by his son, and he orders for his son's eyes to be brought to him on a platter. And from that point, things go from bad to worse. He begins building pyramids of human bodies wherever he goes. And eventually his own bodyguard realised that they are going to have the responsibility of finishing off this guy, because if they don't do it, who knows what. It may say it's a sort of Trumpian vision of horror that lies ahead of them. And so they assassinate him. There are two factions within the bodyguard. The faction that assassinate him are the Persian bodyguards. The people who rush in and protect the harem are the Afghan bodyguards. And they, well, at least according to Afghan sources, which may well not be entirely neutral on the matter, bravely defend the women of Nadir Shah, including his chief wife, who's called Chuki. And he's given the Kohinoor the following morning by Chuki in order to, as a thank you present for keeping them alive in the night. So he gallops off to Kandahar, and Ahmad Shah Abdali builds the state of Afghanistan. He is the father of Afghanistan, like Mahatma Gandhi is the father of this country. He builds Afghanistan using the capital of Nadir Shah's captured jewels. So Afghanistan is created in many ways as a child of the Kohinoor. And like the Kohinoor, obviously, has this sort of continual violence associated with it. Ahmad Shah Abdali passes it down. Ahmad Shah Abdali, of course, only enters Indian textbooks when he comes and defeats the Marathas at Panipat, 1761, and so creating a vacuum which the East India Company in due course will take advantage of. But he does not live long to enjoy this, because his face has been eaten away by a tumour. And like a sort of 18th century version of Robocop, he covers his face with a golden mask, but it continues to rot behind this. The mask is dotted with some of his greatest gems. And this poor character, whose face is being eaten away, has this golden face, but beneath it is suppurating flesh. And by the end, according to one chronicler, maggots were dropping out of his nose and falling into his food as he ate. Anyway, he dies. It goes on from him to his son, to his grandson, and ends up with Shah Shuja, who looks here like some sort of extra from The Hobbit. But there are other versions that make him look a bit more handsome. And Shah Shuja loses Afghanistan. This is the story told in My Return of the King. And flees to the refuge of Ranjit Singh in Lahore. Ranjit Singh has built his kingdom out of the Indian fragments of the Durrani Afghan Empire and rolled back the Afghans as far as the modern Pakistan-Afghan border at the Khyber Pass. And for him, the Kohinoor is the symbol of Afghan sovereignty. The enemies that he